Good morning, students. We are studying the chapter Theory of Demand of Modern Microeconomics. In the last class, we studied about the determinants of demand, the factors which affects the demand. They were the price of the given commodity. There is a direct indirect relationship between the price of the commodity and the demand of the commodity. If the price of the commodity will rise, demand of the commodity will fall, and vice versa. Second determinant was price of the related commodity, in which we talked about substitute goods and complementary goods. There is a direct relationship between the price of the substitute good and demand of the given commodity, and there is inverse relationship between price of the complementary good and demand of the given commodity. Today we are going to talk about the third determinant of the demand, that is income of the consumer. Generally, income of the consumer and demand of the commodity are directly associated. It means when income of the consumer rises, demand of the commodity will also rise. When income of the consumer falls, demand of the consumer will fall. For example, if the income of your family increased, you can say if it becomes 3 lakhs per month, naturally the purchasing power of your family will increase and you would like to consume more and more goods. You may like to go to consume, to have better car, to have better refrigerator, ACs, etc. So, income of the consumer and demand of the commodity are directly associated, and they move in the same direction. But it is not so in every case, because it depends on the nature of the commodity, which may be like normal commodity, inferior commodity, and necessary commodity. First of all, we will talk about normal commodity. Normal commodities are those commodities which are demanded in routine life of the consumer. Income of the consumer and demand of the normal commodities are directly associated and move in the same direction. It means if income of the consumer rises, then the demand of the normal commodity will also rise. And if the income of the consumer falls, then demand of the normal commodity will also fall. It is so because as income of the consumer rises, the purchasing power or real income of the consumer will also rise. With that, demand of the normal commodity will also rise, and vice versa. For example, a rise in the income of the consumer will induce people to demand more quantity of different goods. Next is inferior commodity. Inferior commodities are those low quality commodities which do not have any close cheap substitutes and has negative income effect. There is inverse relationship in the income of the consumer and demand of the inferior commodity. It means that if income of the consumer rises, then demand of the inferior commodity will also rise, and if income of the consumer falls, the demand of the inferior commodity will also fall. It is so because as income of the consumer rises, then the consumer will divert his demand towards better substitute and demand of the inferior commodity will fall and vice versa. Next is necessary commodity. Necessary commodities are those commodities which are necessary for the survival of mankind. For example, life-saving drug for the consumer, like the medicine for blood pressure or medicine for sugar patients. Now, price of the necessary goods generally do not affect the demand of the necessary goods because, for example, if the income of the consumer rises, the consumer will not start consuming 2 tablets instead of 1 tablet of PP. Or if income of the consumer falls, the consumer will not start consuming half tablet instead of 1 tablet. Generally, the price of the commodity, necessary commodity, does not affect the demand of the necessary commodity. Our next determinant is taste and preferences of the consumer. Taste and preference of the consumer directly influence the demand for a commodity. They include change in customs, habits, etc. If a commodity is in fashion or is preferred by the consumer, then the demand of such commodity will rise. On the other hand, demand of the commodity falls if the consumers have no taste for that commodity. Next point is expectation of change in the price in future. If the price of a certain commodity is expected to increase in near future, then the people will buy more of that commodity than what they normally buy. There exists a direct relationship between expectation of change in price in future and change in demand in the current period. For example, if the price of petrol is expected to rise in future, its present demand will increase and vice versa. Now students, we can revise it what we have studied and determinants of demand. For example, first point is price of goods and services. Second is income of the buyer. Third is price of related goods or services. Fourth is tastes of the consumers. And fifth is expectations of change in price in future. Now you can see here, when the demand of a commodity changes due to the change in the price of goods and services, when demand of the goods changes due to the change in the price of its goods and services, then such change in demand is known as change in quantity demanded. For example, if demand of Pepsi changes due to the change in its own price, then such change in demand for Pepsi is known as change in quantity demanded. And whenever demand of a given commodity changes, not because of price, please listen carefully, not because of price, but due to the factors other than price, such as change in the income of the consumer, change in the price of the related goods, or taste and preference of the consumer, then the such change is demand is known as change in demand. I am repeating it, students. Whenever demand for given commodity changes due to the factors other than price, then such change in demand is known as change in demand. For example, if demand for Pepsi changes due to the change in price of Coke or due to the change in income of the consumer or due to the change in taste of the consumer, then it is known as change in demand. Now today we have talked about different determinants of demand and the change in quantity demanded and change in demand. This is all for today's class. Next part of this chapter I am going to do in the next class. Thank you.